So today we'll be reading Matthew 21:33 through 46, the parable of the tenants. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenant seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to him. "They will respect my son," he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance." So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? "He will bring those wretches to a wretched end," they replied, "and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the Scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. Anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet.
Good morning. Today's story is the parable of the tenants. So let's jump in and see what it's about. So first of all, the word tenant refers to a person who is taking care of something. So when it says right here, listen to another parable, there was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a winepress, built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers, moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. So he builds this vineyard, this place to grow grapes and make wine. And then he hired people to be in this vineyard to work it. And those people were the tenants. They're the ones taking care of it. So when it says tenants, he's talking about somebody who is given a job and then is expected to do that job. These people were told, take care of the vineyard, I'll pay you the money, and you grow the fruit. And so it says right here in verse 34, when the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. So the guy who owns the vineyard says, okay, it's been a while, I want to see how my vineyard's doing. So he goes and it's like, all right, you did your job, right? So tell me, how much fruit do we have? What did we make? What did we get? And the tenants, this part's the crazy part, they seized his servants, they beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Basically, not the right choice. They decided that instead of growing fruit and giving it back to the vineyard owner like they're supposed to, they beat up the people that came to collect. They even killed one of them. So then it says in verse 36, he sent other servants to them, and the tenants did the exact same thing. And then last of all, the owner sent his son, saying, they will respect my son. But, yet again, when the tenants saw the son, they said to him, this is the heir, come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. When it says this is the heir, they're saying this is the one who's going to get the vineyard when the one who owns it now dies, so because he's his son, and an inheritance would be getting the vineyard. So he's saying, oh, let's kill him, and then he won't have anybody to give the vineyard to when he dies, so then we'll get it. Which is honestly kind of silly because, if they've already just, killed his servants and killed his sons, there's no way he's his son. There's no way he's going to give them the vineyard. But anyways, they thought it was a good idea. So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. And then this is a story that Jesus is telling, right? And so he asked the question, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? And that's the question I want you to think about. This guy owns the vineyard, and he's hired people to take care of it. And then he comes to see how it's going. And instead of taking care of it, they kill the people that came to come check it out. So what do you think this guy who owns it would do? And this is what Jesus says. He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at the harvest time. So what does this mean for us? It's kind of a really interesting parable, because when you read it, you're like, what are you talking about, Jesus? This seems kind of intense. But what Jesus is saying is the person who owns the vineyard is like God, right? He owns everything, and he gives us a purpose. Just like these tenants were given a purpose. They were told, you need to, I'm going to hire you to take care of this vineyard, to grow the fruit, to turn it into wine. That was their job. And instead of doing their job, they decided, nah, we're not going to obey the one who owns it. We're going to do our own thing. We have to understand that we have also been given a job. Our job is to love God, to know God, and to obey God. That's our job. And yet, this story shows that just like those tenants rejected that job, we reject our job too. So many times we decide to find our happiness in a different way instead of following God. God wants us to know him. That's our job. And when we know him, then we will know joy. He makes us happy. He makes us joyful. Being in his presence, knowing him more and more is what gives us purpose. It gives us joy. That's our job. That's what we were made to do. And yet, because honestly humans are kind of stupid, we go our own way, and we make up our own things, and we reject the job that God has given us. So we're just like those tenants. And so then, what did the one who's like God do? He said, oh, well, let's send some more. Right there in verse 36. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time. And then the tenants rejected them again. So this is something that's pointing out a really important part of God's nature. God is in control of the world, and he made you, he created you, and he gave you a job. And what we're learning right now is that many, many, many times we reject the job that God has given us. But in this story, we see that God keeps trying. He gives people a second chance. He could have came right away and said, you tenants are the worst, and had them all killed because, they killed his servants, right? He could have came along and had them all thrown in jail. He could have done a lot of different things. But instead he said, let's give them a second chance. So he sent some more servants. And then when they beat those guys up, the king said, the one who owned the vineyard said, let's give them a third chance. And this time he sent his son. Does that sound familiar? God sent his son, Jesus, to us too. So there's a parallel here. We have been given a job, and then we have not done our job right. We have not loved God the way we should. We have not obeyed God the way we should. We have not followed God the way we should. And so God sends prophets. He sent people who have written parts of the Bible that say, you're not doing this right. You need to turn back to God. And then that's been rejected. And he sends more people. Every writer in the Bible was told by God, this is something you need to say. So they wrote it down, and then it got added together to the Bible, and we can read that. So every time you read the Bible, it's like God is sending another one of these people to say, listen, you tenant, you're not following what I said. You're not doing your job. And then finally we know in history that Jesus came. And he came along and he said, listen, you guys are not doing what God has asked you to do. And then the question is, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to reject God's son? Or are you going to follow God's son and go back to what your job was? See, if these tenants had responded to the son properly, if they said, oh my goodness, we shouldn't have done that, then I think maybe this vineyard owner would have had mercy on them. In real life, God knows that you've messed up, that you haven't done your job. But he gave us his son as like a last warning to say, hey, obey my son. Follow what he says about me, and you'll be following me, you'll be obeying me, you'll be doing your job, and we'll be okay. But if we reject his son, then like it says, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end. And that's something we don't want to happen to us. So this is a serious parable, right? We always talk about, God is loving, and if you believe in him, you're going to go to heaven. But we don't often talk about what happens if you don't believe in him. And this parable shows us it's not a pretty picture. God has given us a job. If we reject that job, even if he comes after us many times, and that's the part where we can see that he's loving. He loves us because he's given us so many chances. But if we reject his son, if we reject Jesus, then he's going to destroy us because we've not been doing our job. We've not been following him. This last part of the parable says, Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes." So this little phrase, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, is talking about Jesus. Jesus is literally talking about himself right now. When you build a house, you start with all these stones and bricks, and you start, stacking them together. And if you find a stone that you think, "Ew, that's not very helpful," you might throw it away. That's what he's talking about, the stone the builders rejected. But then it says, has become the cornerstone. And the cornerstone would be like one of the most important stones in the house that is holding up important things or capping off a certain part. And God is saying, Jesus is saying through this, that the things that we think are unimportant, God is showing us are important. What you do with Jesus, if you think, Jesus, not important, I'm going to reject him, it's going to be bad news, because God is saying, no. That one that you just rejected, he's the most important one. What you do with my son is the most important thing. Are you going to reject my son, or are you going to follow my son? So this parable, that's what it's about. It's about a God who has given us a job. It's about tenants, us, who have failed that job. It's about a God who's given us many, many chances. And then it's also about the Son and what we're going to do with that Son. Are we going to trust him? Are we going to believe him? Are we going to obey him? Are we going to submit to him? Or are we going to reject him as well? That's the question.